What if you handed over your entire life savings, every single dollar you worked decades to earn, every dime you thought would buy you peace in your old age, to the one person you believed you could trust? This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about betrayal, about a promise shattered, about a friendship poisoned. My name is Arthur Art McCullough. I served 22 years in the United States Army. I've faced enemies in foreign deserts, stared down danger most men would never understand. But nothing prepared me for the enemy I invited into my own home. His name was Robert Vance, and to most people, he was a pillar of the community. A man who shook hands at church, sponsored Little League games, smiled with the kind of confidence that made people feel safe. He was charming, convincing, the kind of guy you'd never suspect. And that's exactly what made him so dangerous, because Robert Vance didn't just take my money. He didn't just drain the Social Security savings I'd guarded like treasure. He stole my security. He stole my peace. He stole my future. For months, I lived in a fog of shame. How could I, a veteran trained to spot danger, a man who'd survived war zones, be so completely blindsided in my own backyard? The official term for what he ran is a Ponzi scheme, a fancy name for lies stacked on lies. But I don't call it that. I call it theft of the soul. Because this wasn't just about investments or interest rates. This was about trust. He promised me golden years, the kind of retirement every soldier dreams of. Instead, he left me with nothing but fear. And yet, Robert Vance made one fatal mistake. He underestimated me. See, I may be old, but I'm still a soldier. I still wake up at dawn with that fire in my chest. I still know how to plan, how to fight, and how to win. He thought I would just shrink into the shadows, humiliated, too broken to stand up. What he didn't know was that I had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous enemy you can ever make. Robert Vance thought he'd pulled off the perfect scam. But what he actually did was start a war. So here's the question I want to ask you. What would you do if someone stole your tomorrow? Because in this story, you're about to see what happens when a war hero refuses to stay silent, when a betrayed man turns his shame into strategy, and when justice doesn't just come from the courts but from the fire of payback itself. If you're new here, welcome to Payback Stories, where betrayal meets retribution. Subscribe now, because this isn't just a story. This is a battlefield, and it's only just begun. Let me take you back to the beginning. The sun was warmer then. I'd been retired for 5 years, living quietly off my Army pension and Social Security. It wasn't a life of luxury, but it was steady, modest, mine. And after 22 years in uniform, I felt I'd earned the right to that peace. But peace is a fragile thing. It only takes one crack for the whole foundation to split. My wife, Sarah, had passed a few years earlier, and with her gone, the house felt like a cavern. Too quiet, too empty. My world had shrunk down to coffee at the local diner, conversations with the same handful of regulars, and afternoons spent tending to my rose bushes. That's where Robert Vance walked in. He had that kind of presence you notice right away. Charismatic, well-dressed, the kind of man who made people lean in when he talked. He wasn't pushy, not at first. He was just present, always a wave at the diner, always a smile in passing. The kind of man people trusted before they had any reason to. Eventually, we struck up conversation. He asked about my Army service, about Sarah, about the little details most people overlooked. And then he told me about himself. His father, he claimed, was a veteran too. Said he grew up with nothing but respect for men who served their country. It felt good to be seen, to be recognized, to matter again. And maybe if I'd been sharper, I would have asked why a man who barely knew me seemed so invested in my story. But loneliness dulls your edges. It makes you want to believe. One day, over pie and black coffee, Robert mentioned his work. Said he was a financial advisor for the everyday American. Not the wealthy elite, not corporate big shots. Ordinary folks like me. He said his passion was helping seniors make their savings work for them. The way he said it, it didn't sound like business. It sounded like mission. And then he leaned in and said, "Art, you shouldn't just be getting by. You should be living. You should be traveling. You should be leaving a legacy for your family. Your country served you. Now it's time to let your money serve you." I'll be honest, the words hit me right in the chest, because the truth was, I did have dreams. Quiet ones I never said out loud. I wanted to stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon, Sarah's memory at my side. I wanted to help my granddaughter pay for college, so she wouldn't have to struggle like her parents did. I wanted to do more than just survive the years I had left. Robert knew that. He could see it, and he knew exactly how to speak to it. He showed me glossy brochures, polished charts, graphs that meant nothing to me but looked official. He spoke with confidence about high-yield bonds, exclusive funds, low-risk opportunities. It all sounded legitimate. It all sounded safe still. I remember one moment that should have made me pause. He said, "The banks don't want you to know about these options. They keep the good stuff for themselves." And I laughed at the time, thinking it was just small talk. But later I'd remember those words and realize con men always tell you that you're special, that you're in on a secret. It's the easiest way to lower your guard, but I didn't see that then. Because the truth is, the hook wasn't the jargon, the paperwork, or the numbers. The hook was the dream. He wasn't selling me an investment. He was selling me a future, a second chance at life, and I bought it. Why is it always the dream that's the most dangerous part? I needed answers. No more voicemails, no more excuses. So I drove to Robert's house. It wasn't hard to find. A sprawling two-story home in the new part of town. Trimmed hedges, spotless lawn. The kind of place that made you wonder how someone afforded it. And as I sat there in my truck, staring at that polished white fence, the realization struck me like a hammer. This house wasn't built by his brilliance. It was paid for by people like me, by men who trusted him, by families who now had nothing. His car was in the driveway. There was no denying he was home. I marched up to the front door and pounded on it, each knock fueled by the rage boiling inside me. When he finally opened the door, the man I thought I knew was gone. No warm smile, no handshake, just a cold, flat stare, his voice sharp with irritation. "Arthur, this is harassment," he said. Harassment. As if asking for the return of a life's savings was some petty nuisance. I demanded answers. I demanded our money back. And that's when he looked me dead in the eye and delivered the words that will haunt me forever. "All investments carry risk. You signed the documents. You knew what you were getting into. The market turned. The market turned." He spoke those words like they meant nothing. Like my 22 years of sacrifice, my wife's memory, my granddaughter's future were just numbers on a spreadsheet that had evaporated. I wanted to shout, to hit him, to drag him out onto his perfect lawn and make him feel what I was feeling. But all I could do was stand there, a decorated veteran reduced to a naive child on his pristine porch. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was personal. This man had broken bread in my home. He had spoken my late wife's name as though he honored her. And now he was hiding behind legalese and fine print, knowing damn well that men like me didn't speak that language. We spoke in trust, in handshakes, in honor, and he had gutted all of it. I turned to leave, hollowed out, defeated, my boots heavy on the concrete, but then I saw it. Through the slats of his half-open garage door, parked like a trophy, was a brand new, fire-engine red sports car. Sleek, polished, gleaming under the light. The kind of car that cost more than I'd ever given him. The kind of car you buy when you're swimming in other people's money. In that instant, something inside me snapped. The shame didn't vanish, but it hardened. It transformed. From guilt into anger, from despair into fire, because there it was. My money, Mike's money, the money of every man I'd led into this trap, gleaming back at me in cherry red paint and chrome. What would you feel? Standing there on that manicured driveway, staring at your stolen future polished to a shine in your enemy's garage. I'll tell you what I felt. The end of shame, and the beginning of war. I needed answers. Shame had a way of weighing you down. It pressed on my chest like the flak jacket I'd worn in desert heat. But anger has its own weight, different. It steadies you. It points you. It gives you a direction to move. So I did what I knew how to do. I stopped reacting and I started planning. The first rule of any operation is to secure the facts. Emotions are fuel, but facts are the map. You don't charge a position because your heart tells you to. You recon, you gather, you verify. That's what I told myself the first night after the car. No shouting. No threats. No trembling phone calls that might get me written off as a crank. I'd been a soldier long enough to know the value of a slow, quiet strategy. I went home and pulled out every scrap of paper I had. Statements, emails, the glossy brochures Robert had given me that first day over pie. I made copies. I spread the documents across the kitchen table like a battlefield map. Broken promises, stamped signatures, investment names that barely meant anything to me. But patterns reveal themselves if you look long enough. Next, I built a roster. Every man I'd brought in. Every friend who'd paid their trust into Robert's hands. Mike, obviously. Tom from the VFW. A woman from church who'd wanted to leave a little for her grandchildren. Names, amounts, dates. I called each one not to panic them, but to listen. The first thing you learn in war is that people tell you more than they intend to when they think someone's really listening. The stories lined up. Different accounts, different towns, the same promises. Some had been told their funds were locked in growth cycles. Others were told the paperwork had been misplaced and would be replaced. A common phrase kept surfacing. You signed the documents. Like a talisman to ward off responsibility. Like a magician pulling a curtain to hide the trick. It wasn't just grief anymore. It looked like a pattern, a scheme. And schemes leave trails. So I started following them. I remembered the receptionist's look across from Robert's office. Pity edged with something like fear. People like that know things, even if they don't want to get involved. I paid a visit to the diner more often, not for coffee, but for casual listening. Financial scams thrive on silence. They rely on people not talking. I wanted talk. I wanted names. I wanted dates. I learned Robert used at least 2 shell companies for the accounts. He'd moved money around like a magician shuffling cards. The more I asked, the more the map filled in. Phone numbers, addresses, a registrar's entry for a company that existed only on paper. Little things that scream fraud to anyone who knows where to look. But I'm not an investigator. I'm a soldier. So I called one, not the FBI, not yet. I called Joe Riley, a kid who'd grown up on our block and gone on to the state police. Quiet fellow, steady hands. He owed me a favor from a neighborhood bar fight 2 decades ago. And favors in small towns don't get bankrupted. They get called in. I didn't shout my anger down the phone. I laid out the facts. I asked for advice. How do you preserve evidence? How do you make sure old men's statements don't get lost in bureaucracy? Joe listened. He didn't promise fireworks. He promised procedure. That was what I wanted. Procedure is a path to truth. He told me to stop moving money, to collect everything in writing, to get sworn statements if possible. He explained chain of custody, forensic accounting, the way a criminal's bravado dissolves when cameras and subpoenas start asking questions. So I did that. I went back to every man I'd involved and asked them to sign simple, crisp statements. What did he promise? When? What did you transfer and when? They were embarrassed at first. Shame makes you small. But they signed. The paperwork tasted like reclaiming dignity. Each signature was a small private oath. We will not be silenced. We will not be ashamed into inactivity. While the paperwork accumulated, I began collecting a different kind of evidence. Receipts. Bank transfer confirmations. The emails Robert had written that sounded too smooth to be real. I tracked deposits into accounts with names that matched the shell companies. I sat for hours in the county clerk's office reading through business registrations, looking for fingerprints of fraud. The same registered address used over and over, names that changed like masks. It was tedious work. It was excruciating, but every small fact felt like ammunition. At night, I'd sit awake and plan how to present this, who to hand it to. The FBI is not a stage for theatrics. They want neat piles of proof. They want witnesses who aren't weeping and waving. They want people who looked like they'd done the work to call them. So I became methodical. I labeled files. I made an index. I wrote a short narrative. Who, what, when, where, how. Because stories are persuasive when the facts line up. There was another rule I'd learned in war. Never confront the enemy on their turf with only your heart. Bring the law, bring witnesses, bring the camera. So I had 2 parallel threads. 1, build an airtight case. 2, prepare the men. Teach them how to testify to truth, not emotion. We practiced together at the VFW, shaky at first, then steadier. Say dates, say amounts, say the exact words he used. Don't accuse with adjectives. Point to papers, and there was a last, quieter plan. Exposure. The kind that leaves no room for PR spin. The local newspaper had done a profile on Robert the year before. Hometown hero helps seniors secure futures. I kept a copy. I called an old reporter, a woman named Dana who'd once interviewed my son about a high school program. I didn't shout, I showed. Documents, patterns, sworn statements. She asked the right questions. Have you reported this? Who else is affected? How much money? She smelled it. That's the thing about truth. Even journalists can smell when a story is righteous. This wasn't a rampage. It was a campaign. Quiet, precise, like laying siege rather than charging the gates. I prepared to move when the time was right. Not because I craved revenge for its own sake, but because justice to me is a mission with rules. You don't take lives. You take truth. You present it to the courtrooms, to the cameras, to the record keepers who insist on fairness. And somewhere in the middle of all that tedium, the fire in my chest changed its color. It was no longer only rage. It had become resolve. Not to prove that Robert was a monster, that fact was becoming obvious, but to make sure the men I'd led into that field got something back. Money, dignity, a warning to anyone who thought they could turn neighbor into ledger. When the dossier was full, when the statements were signed and notarized and the bank trails mapped, I finally called Joe back. "We're ready," I said. He didn't say much. A good operator never yells before the raid, but I could hear the shift in his voice. We'd assembled a case the way we would prepare for a mission. Patient, thorough, inevitable. A soldier doesn't root for revenge. A soldier executes a plan. And in that execution there is justice. The investigation wasn't swift. It was a slow grinding machine. Papers, signatures, subpoenas. For us, time crawled. Months blurred into half a year, then into more. Every day without an answer felt like another wound. The silence was agonizing. Had they forgotten us? Had Robert's smooth talk worked on the FBI the way it had worked on me? And then one evening the phone rang. "Arthur, this is Agent Carter. We've found it. It's a classic Ponzi scheme. He was using new investors' money to pay the old ones. Your early returns. That was just other people's life savings. Other people's lives. Our hopes cannibalized to feed his lie." The day of the raid came like a storm breaking after a drought. I parked a discreet distance from Robert's mansion, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my heart hammering like it had before combat. Then they came. Federal agents in dark jackets swarming the pristine lawn, the perfect hedges. They carried out boxes, folders, hard drives, Robert's empire in cardboard and plastic. The dragon was under siege. I'll never forget the sight of him, Robert Vance, led out in handcuffs. The man who had shaken hands with veterans, smiled at children, spoken my wife's name with respect. Now his head was lowered, his shoulders hunched, his expensive shirt rumpled under the firm grip of agents. He was arrested, charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, words that sounded almost too clean for the damage he had caused. The community reeled. Neighbors who once praised him now whispered in shock. The pillar was made of sand. But the arrest wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the real battle, the trial. Robert's lawyer was a shark, circling the courtroom with polished shoes and polished lies. He tried to paint me as a confused old man, a soldier past his prime who couldn't understand the risks of complex financial products. It was humiliation all over again. To sit there, listening, knowing he was twisting my story into weakness. Then the day came when I was called to the stand. I won't lie, I was terrified. Combat is one thing. Courtrooms are another. I walked to the witness box, the weight of every friend, every brother I had led into this mess pressing down on me. Robert sat at the defense table, his lawyer whispering in his ear. But he wouldn't meet my eyes. Not once. He was diminished. Not the polished man in the tailored suit. Just a cornered thief in a cheap off-the-rack jacket. The prosecutor lifted one of his glossy fake statements for the jury to see. "Mr. McCullough," she asked, "did you believe this document was real?" I didn't hesitate. I looked directly at the 12 jurors, ordinary people, the kind of people he had fooled, and I said, I believed he was real. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, because it was never about the numbers. It was about trust, about the man who had looked me in the eye and promised me safety. The closing arguments were made. The prosecutor painted him as the architect of ruin. The defense tried one last time to cast us as careless dreamers, and then the jury filed out. The room went still. The fate of my future, the futures of my friends, rested in the hands of 12 strangers. And all we could do was wait. The jury was out for less than 6 hours, but it felt like 6 years. When they finally filed back into the courtroom, their faces gave nothing away. Blank measured, no hints, no comfort. The foreman stood, papers trembling just slightly in his hands. Guilty. The word echoed in the silent courtroom like a shot fired in the dark. Guilty. Again. Guilty. Over and over. On every single count. Robert Vance and the charismatic neighbor, the smooth-talking advisor. The viper who had wrapped himself around our trust was no longer a free man. The mask was gone. The game was over. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The system had worked. But the story wasn't finished. The FBI had frozen his assets. The sprawling house. The shiny cars, the bank accounts he thought were untouchable. Through a restitution order, every stolen dollar was traced, collected, and returned. Piece by piece, the life he had built on our backs was dismantled. The day the money was wired back into my account, I didn't feel joy. Not relief, not triumph. I felt something quieter. A deep, steady peace I hadn't known in years. For the first time since Sarah's passing, I felt the war inside me go still. The battle was over. The local newspaper ran a story. Retired veteran brings down Ponzi schemer, saves senior savings. They printed my picture beside a flag, called me a hero. I didn't feel like one, but I wasn't a victim anymore. To my community, I was something else. A reminder that even in old age, you can still fight back. Mike called me the night the story ran. His voice was thick with emotion. We got it all back, Art. We got it all back because of you. That meant more than the money. That was my honor restored. Robert Vance sits in a cell now, his empire reduced to a cot, 4 walls and bars. No sports cars, no luxury homes, no charm that could save him. Just time, but my story was only beginning to be heard, because once the battle is finally won, there's only one question left. What do you do with victory? They say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I don't believe that. What doesn't kill you leaves scars. Deep, permanent ones. I carry mine every day. I still glance over my shoulder when I walk into the bank. I still hesitate before answering a friendly smile. Some wounds don't heal, they remind, but those scars, they also serve a purpose. They remind me that even when you're at your lowest, your weakest, you still have fight left in you. My revenge wasn't about fists or fury. It wasn't about violence. It was about vigilance, about using the truth as my weapon, about standing up when silence would have been easier. It was about refusing to remain a victim. This ordeal taught me something brutal, something I wish I had learned sooner. Evil doesn't always come with a snarl. Sometimes it comes neatly dressed with a firm handshake, a smile that feels like friendship and promises that sound like hope. It doesn't prey on your greed. It preys on your trust, your dreams, your longing for security. So if you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Trust your gut. If an offer seems too good to be true, it is. Don't be embarrassed to ask questions. Don't feel guilty for demanding proof. There is no shame in protecting what's yours. The years you worked, the sacrifices you made, the future you've earned. And if the day ever comes when you're targeted, when someone you trust betrays you, I want you to remember me. Remember Arthur McCullough. Remember the old soldier who was supposed to fade away but instead stood his ground. Because the most powerful force in the world isn't money. It isn't status. It's a righteous person with nothing left to lose. Fight with the weapons you have. For me, it was a cardboard box filled with documents and the courage to speak in a courtroom. For you, it might be something else. But fight. Because in the end, the greatest payback isn't watching your enemy fall. It isn't the verdict or the sentence or even the restitution. The greatest payback is reclaiming the peace they tried to steal from you. And that, my friends, is a victory worth fighting for.